Voldemort is one of the most recognizable and iconic villains in all of literature, the pivotal antagonist of the Harry Potter franchise. And even if you haven't read the books yourselves, you most likely at least have heard of him. A character who, in the Harry Potter world, represents almost the ultimate evil and the epitome of darkness and magical corruption. In my opinion, J.K. Rowling's characterization of Voldemort in the books is fantastic. He's chilling and psychotic, and he exudes an aura of menace and fear to the characters around him. He's so feared that characters can't even bring themselves to say his name, referring to him as he who must not be named. Now, as you might be able to tell, I really love Voldemort as a character in the books. I think the books wouldn't have done nearly as well as they did if he wasn't there, and portrayed in the way he was portrayed. But I'm also very disappointed with how he was depicted in the Harry Potter movies. I think the movies really mischaracterized Voldemort. I think they didn't understand him as a character, what makes him iconic and what makes him a menacing villain. I don't think they understood his mindset or what drives him, and I don't think he was done justice. So what I want to talk about today is what I think the movies did wrong and why I believe his portrayal in the books was done much better. And I know there's a risk that I get accused of being a bit of a book snob, but each point that I go through, I'll be explaining why exactly I believe the choices made in the books were better than the choices made in the movie, without just simply pointing out that it's different in the books. So I'll explore why objectively it's a better characterization of Voldemort. So let's get right into it. There are 3 key areas in which I feel the movies failed with Voldemort, each of which I'll be discussing in turn. The first, Voldemort using his physicality over his magic. Second, Voldemort being too emotive. And the third, Voldemort looking and sounding too human. Now, let's get right into the first point. In the movies, Voldemort is shown to rely really heavily on his physicality. Every movement and action of his seems jittery and violent, and this reliance on his physicality really bleeds into almost every scene and interaction he has with other characters. For example, when he duels other wizards, you really get the sense that he's really throwing his body into it. He's constantly grabbing at and touching people. This is a stark contrast to the books, where a lot of the time he's mostly depicted as being eerily still or moving in a slow and controlled fashion. But just before I get into why I don't like the movie version over the book version, I'm just going to highlight 3 examples from the movie which speak to my point about his physicality. So the first is his appearance in Goblet of Fire, at the graveyard when he's resurrected. After first grabbing Wormtail's arm, he prowls restlessly around the circle of Death Eaters that have appeared before him. He then quickly moves between them, ripping their masks off their face. And then when he goes on to monologue to Harry and the Death Eaters, he's constantly moving and gesticulating. Seems restless and agitated. Then coming on to some other scenes where we see Voldemort. When he's fighting Dumbledore in Order of the Phoenix at the Ministry of Magic, and again when he's chasing Harry in the Deathly Hallows and dueling him again with magic. He seems to be physically exerting himself. As I mentioned earlier, he throws almost his whole body into the motions whenever he's casting a spell, and you can hear physical grunts of exertion as he's doing it. And then finally, the worst example of this, I think, is right at the end of Deathly Hallows, when he's physically grappling and wrestling with Harry as they fly around the castle. So why is this bad? Why is this significant? I believe this fundamentally misunderstands Voldemort's character, the fact that he's shown to be so physical. In the books, Voldemort reminds me of ice. That's the metaphor I'd use for him. He has a very chilling aura about him. Not only is he cold and calculating, but he's also terrifyingly powerful. It's his absolute mastery of dark magic that really makes him intimidating to other characters, the fact that they're so outmatched by his magical ability. This magical prowess and superiority is also what Voldemort values about himself and values in other people. Voldemort doesn't need to stoop to using his physicality because he has no need to. Everything he does is with his wand. In the books, he's frequently described as lazy, moving in a slow and controlled fashion. This feeds into his characterization. He believes himself to be the strongest. He values magical ability over all else. And Voldemort hates those without magic. He hates muggles. He looks down on them. I don't even think he sees them really as human. And so for him to resort to using his physicality would be him bringing himself down to their level, because his magic is what sets him apart from muggles, and his magical superiority is also what sets him apart from other wizards. And this apparent lack of physical effort, or this lack of him relying on his physicality, is also part of an important power dynamic between Voldemort and other characters that he interacts with. Because this is the way he conveys power and dominance in a situation. This is how he controls the room and controls the other people around him. So now let's turn to the book and let's pick out one example out of the ones we walked through and really focus in on it to illustrate the differences in how Voldemort is portrayed. Let's focus in on the graveyard scene in the Goblet of Fire just after Voldemort is resurrected. I'm going to highlight a few quotes here and I'll flash them up on the screen and I'll read them out as well. This quote: Voldemort stood in silence, waiting for them. Then one of the Death Eaters fell to his knees, crawled towards Voldemort, and kissed the hem of his black robes. The Death Eaters behind him did the same. Second quote: No one spoke, no one moved except Wormtail, who was upon the ground, still sobbing over his bleeding arm. And the final quote for this section: One of the men suddenly flung himself forwards, breaking the circle. Trembling from head to foot, he collapsed at Voldemort's feet. Voldemort began to laugh. He raised his wand. Crucio. There's a couple of key things we can infer from these book passages. Now, in each of these instances, we see the power dynamic between Voldemort and the rest of the Death Eaters. Voldemort is standing still in all of these passages, and everybody else around him is either too afraid to move or immobilized. The Death Eaters are the first ones to break the movement taboo, and notice how Voldemort responds. He responds only by raising his wand and uttering a single word to torture the Death Eater, a minuscule movement requiring very little physical effort. And in fact, if you read the rest of this chapter, he barely moves at all in this chapter, especially compared to the scene in the movie where he's constantly in motion. When other characters move in the chapter, it's mostly at the direction of Voldemort himself. He orders Wormtail to free Harry, he orders Wormtail to give him back his wand. The Death Eaters either react or grovel before him. Even when Voldemort first emerges from the cauldron after he's got his body back, he doesn't even bother to dress himself. He commands Wormtail instead to rope him. Now look how many times the word lazily is used in this chapter while describing Voldemort. So again, quote 1, "Hold out your arm," said Voldemort lazily. Second quote: "And yet you ran from my mark when a faithful Death Eater sent it into the sky last summer," said Voldemort lazily. Final quote: "He walked lazily over to stand next to Harry." These quotes and the ones before were all taken from the same chapter, so it's very clear what J.K. Rowling is trying to convey when she describes Voldemort like this. The excessive motion in the movie compared to the book reduces our perception of Voldemort, and it makes him less menacing because he seems less dominating in his surroundings. In the movies, Voldemort moves up to each Death Eater, whereas in the books they're made to come towards him. When they come towards him in the books, it's without Voldemort really saying or doing anything. It's just his aura which is so frightening to them. Even in our own lives, many people associate effortlessness with skill and power. What's more impressive in a fight? Someone who dominates their opponent easily or someone who struggles for their victory? Who would you least want to fight? It's maybe even a subtle difference between the book and the movie, but you definitely subconsciously feel the difference in the power dynamic. And not only this, but it undermines the mindset of Voldemort, a man who believes in his own magical supremacy above all else. Again, he shouldn't have a need to physically be interacting with characters in the way he does in the movie. It takes away from that core, fundamental belief of his. Now, all of this leads into my second point, which is closely tied with the first point, and to be honest, will also closely tie into the third point. And that is that Voldemort is too expressive in the movies. Part of this overexpressiveness is what I've already talked about with his physical movement, but it's also shown through his emotions, his facial expressions, and how he talks. Voldemort in the movies comes across as almost theatrical at times, frequently exhibits loud, expressive anger and frustration. His face is constantly emoting what he's feeling, and he quite often seems right on the edge of anger. And he has weird moments of comedy and awkwardness. As I mentioned before, Voldemort in the books is chilling and menacing. He's a figure of abject fear. People are so afraid of this character that they are even afraid to say his name. He's the greatest dark wizard who ever lived. This aura of menace is really diminished by how Voldemort is shown in these movies. Part of his menace comes from this cold, inhuman demeanor of his. For those of you who haven't read the books or who haven't read them in a while, most of the time Voldemort is relatively calm and in control of the situation, as I was mentioning in the scene in the Goblet of Fire. But at times when he loses control of the situation, his fury erupts, and those moments feel really impactful. Like for example, the first time he realizes that Harry knows about the Horcruxes and he just slays everybody in the room. This unpredictability gives an extra edge to his menace, which the movies undermine by making him constantly angry. There are also lots of scenes where he oddly laughs and he shouts his spells in odd ways. And again, I feel like this makes him almost an object of ridicule rather than somebody to be feared. I feel like one of the things that makes villains scary and intimidating is that cold, psychotic nature, coupled with that violent unpredictability. It keeps you in suspense, it builds up tension. It's not the same when somebody is constantly angry. And some of this theatrical anger I feel like is a result of overacting or overdoing it. It feels forced and not natural. Some of the facial expressions seem almost comical. And this leads me in quite nicely to my final point, that Voldemort is really too humanized in these movies. Now, when I say this, your immediate thought is probably his physical appearance, and that's definitely a part of it, but it's not the only thing I mean. Films render Voldemort too human in both his appearance and his demeanor. So let's talk about his demeanor first. Now, Voldemort in the books is and should be unrelatable in his thinking. He's committed countless atrocities. He tried to murder Harry as a baby, and he's murdered and tortured countless other people. His only concerns are for himself and his power. And as the old saying goes, you fear what you don't understand. All these qualities of Voldemort make him more scary and more menacing to us as the readers or viewers, and also to other characters in the world. Because he's so far removed from what makes people human, that he instead becomes something monstrous and alien to us. And this is physically represented through his physical appearance and how he sounds. In the books, he's described as tall and skeletally thin, with unnaturally long fingers. He has no lips, and there's lots of emphasis put on his skull-like face. His voice is constantly described as high and cold, often coming out as a sibilant hiss, emphasizing his association with serpents, which are obviously not human. But these qualities were all significantly dialed back in the movies. He's meant to be unearthly and unsettling, a physical representation of the darkness that so utterly consumed him. But in the movies, he looks less like a creature from another world and more like a pale human. His voice also lacks that eerie, otherworldly quality from the books. And what this does is it humanizes Voldemort, making him less terrifying and more approachable. It strips away the aura that Rowling crafted, making him less a creature of dark magic and more a mere man. There's two scenes in the movie in particular which I think really hurt the characterization of Voldemort by humanizing him too much, and therefore making him less menacing. First is when he takes Lucius's wand from him. And I'm sure it was intended to be a comedic scene where he mocks Lucius by copying what he was saying and shaking his head, almost like a small child would. It's awkward and strange, and it doesn't fit with somebody like Voldemort, who's meant to be, again, an object of abject fear to others. And the second is when he awkwardly hugs Draco Malfoy at the end of the Deathly Hallows. Again, the scene is weird and awkward, and I'm not sure if it's meant to be comedic or not, but it really ruins again that aura of Voldemort's. Turns him into a joke and hurts the image of the greatest dark wizard of all time. So, in conclusion, I think the way Voldemort was portrayed in the Harry Potter movies really misses the fundamentals of what actually made him such a formidable and terrifying antagonist. Voldemort in the books isn't just a human villain, he's a symbol of terror and the manifestation of the darkest of magics, the absolute corruption and degradation of the human soul. He's so far gone in his journey into darkness that he's barely even a human anymore. There's a significant departure from his chilling, inhuman aura that J.K. Rowling painstakingly crafted. For me, it was a really disappointing of what was a great character. So, that's it for today, guys. If you've listened this far, thank you very much for listening to everything I've had to say, and I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts and opinions as well. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Please leave a comment and I'll definitely do my best to get back to you. Also, if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more on any other topics or characters, please just let me know as well. Thank you.